you all there. Now, I would like to introduce Josh. So Josh joined Y2Y in 2021 after working 20 years developing a body of work that seeks balance between land-based conservation and development in Canada and the United States. His approach has always been dedicated to the pursuit of building social and ecological resilience. With his background as a planner in mountain towns, a landscape architect, and a national park ranger, Josh's current work is about sustaining how we might live, work, and play within the Y2Y corridor, the most intact mountain ecosystem on the planet. Without further ado, let's please welcome Josh.
Thanks everybody for coming. Good to see some familiar faces out there. I wanted to say before I get started, we're going to try something a little bit different. We have a pretty intimate audience, which is great. I'm going to talk at you for a little while, about 30 to 40 minutes. And then I'm hoping that we take a quick break and get into a circle, because the topics that I'm going to talk about are meant to inspire, and there is a moving forward that could happen within this valley. And so I want everyone's thoughts and ideas, and I want to have a bit of a dialogue. So if you're not up for that, that's fine. You can check out at that point in time, but it'd be lovely if everyone stuck around and contributed to a bit of conversation about coexisting with wildlife. So, thanks. Oh, and if you have questions throughout, that's fine, as long as they're for clarity and things like that. Otherwise, if they're good for dialogue, let's save them to the end. You can interrupt me if you need to. So thanks, Biosphere, for having me talk tonight. I'm the Senior Manager of Communities and Conservation at Y2Y. I also have, I've asked my colleagues, Bryn McClellan and Adam Lennard, to be here, as well as some other Y2Yers, for a bit of backup, because there's some pieces in here that might require some more technical prowess that these two have. I mentioned a few reports that Y2Y has done, and they were central to those reports. So I was born on Haudenosaunee territory back east in the land of the crabapple blossom, known today as upstate New York. I'm from fifth generation European immigrants, and I immigrated to Canada in 2010. And just recently left my home here in Canmore to reside on the land of the Salix, Sinixt, and Ktunaxa First Nations in the West Kootenays. I've always been a visitor on the lands I've lived on, but like Stoney Nakoda, I understand myself to be human, to be of the land. I'm the land, and the land is me. And I bring that connection to all the work that I do at Y2Y throughout the entire geography. So here at Y2Y, we work at this scale that's sometimes beyond what's humanly comprehensible, sometimes bigger than the home ranges of grizzlies. But on the whole, it's a scale that can be incongruent with the idea of community and land relationship. But we really work at this scale because it's effective when it comes to inspiring action at the level or at the way that nature really requires us to do. So however, this action is really only possible because of the partnerships we foster within communities throughout the region. It's those partnerships, particularly those with knowledge holders, that make the scale of large landscape conservation meaningful and able. So what I do at Y2Y is largely about helping to heal humanity's relationship with the land. That's how I see my job. And we're actively working to be a trusted ally in ways that support this vision at scale. So all the reasons for trust between colonial and Indigenous governments really have been betrayed repeatedly throughout history. So our work also is to help restore that trust. So I understand that trust is a thing to be earned, and that relationships are formed at the speed of trust. So thanks for coming to spend an hour here this evening. So I specifically work at the intersection of conservation and communities and manage the human-wildlife coexistence file at Y2Y. So what is a community? Community really could be defined as a unifying body of common interests, or it could be a particular geography. For our work, we define them both. We use them both as culturally based and geographically based communities. And we recognize that oftentimes work is best done with culturally based communities to achieve a certain outcome on the land or within a geographic community. So to be effective, we also need to hold two worldviews, in this case, simultaneously. Much of what we need to consider transcends colonial and jurisdictional boundaries. So consider the two maps shown here. We constantly hold these two ways of seeing, using the land and being in relationship with the land together as we do our work. So within the Alberta's eastern slopes, we use grizzly bears, as you probably all know, as an indicator for our work, indicator species. They're an umbrella species. Safeguard them, we safeguard a lot of other living things. And they also need a lot of room to roam and are of a deep interest of many of us, for many of us, particularly the prairie-based and mountain-based First Nations. If more people, more recreation, more development continue to come and displace grizzlies, we know this will greatly impact an array of species and cultures, including the identity of this valley, and many of the businesses and livelihoods that really depend upon that identity. So here's two numbers. This is the numerical context for wildlife in this valley. From tree line to tree line, the Bow Valley's 7 kilometers wide. That's a narrow valley. And within that space, more than 80% of quality habitat's been taken up by human development. So with human presence extending beyond that on trails. So that's the context really of what we're dealing with in this particular locale. But before diving into some of the things I want to share with you all, I'd like to share this quote from, I think, one of our best system thinkers ever. So most often, if we wish to bring about change, it's best to start with understanding what's been successful already. It's best to derive purposes from behavior and use examples of behavior to spur better behavior. But one big challenge for communities is keeping track of their cumulative effects on the land. So in 2022, with help from the LC's group, we published a report that considered how grizzlies move across the landscape, as well as the risk of human-bear conflict in this valley. The study spanned about 80 years, used 50 years of data to get us to the present, and then projected 30 years into the future. And although each are consequential, the outcomes of this report, informal trails followed closely by housing development, have the greatest impact on grizzly movement and pose the greatest risk for an increase in human-bear conflict. So compared to the base case scenario of 2050, business as usual, the no informal trail strategy or scenario reduced the conflict risk area by about 41%. So this means that no informal trails, so only trails on the landscape that are currently designated by Alberta Parks, by the town, those are the designated trails. So this would mean that no informal trails were developed. So the eventual Canmore area trail strategy, otherwise known as CATS, which is underway right now, that's going to help set some guidelines for managing pirate trails. Groups like Canva will continue to play a role in promoting compliance within their membership. So number two, the limited urban expansion scenario, that resulted in a reduced conflict risk area by 35%. So this is a scenario in which the development footprint of Canmore and surrounding areas didn't necessarily expand the way we expect. However, limited urban expansion is growing less and less likely due to there being what seems to be an ongoing support, government support of development rights over ecological integrity in many ways. So then we have the other scenario that was modeled, and that's the restricted recreation scenario. So this means that intensity of growth of recreational trails would decline by 50% by 2050. So a combination of this CAT plan that's underway right now, compliance and enforcement from governments, groups like Canmore, Kananaskis Tourism, how they would promote this region could help realize this particular model. Another study that I want to share with you all is currently underway, but it was concurrent to the cumulative effects modeling work. Our science and knowledge team has been engaged in a really large recreation ecology project aimed at filling knowledge gaps expressed by land managers. These knowledge gaps are related to data regarding recreation, its use, and as well as an intensity, as well as how recreation may impact certain sensitive wildlife species. So this project started in 2020. It's just about complete. We're starting to share a lot of the results of this. And it fostered several partnerships with organizations to compile recreation and wildlife data to inform decision-making. So the research highlights a growing need for creative approaches towards landscape level recreation planning, as well as to try and limit the impacts on wildlife, such as mountain caribou, wolverine, grizzly bears in the Rockies. Those are the three primary species we looked at. And so if you zoom into the last line on this slide right here. That's grizzly bear data. And this basically shows where the hotspots are, shows where high quality habitat are. And if you zoom into where Canmore is, which is right about here, you'll notice there's very little high quality habitat left, and there's a lot of recreation. So outdoor recreation, it's really a strong socioeconomic driver in this region, as well as many others in the Rockies. So it's important to maintain that and maintain quality nature-based experiences for residents and visitors, but it's also critical to maintain large landscape connectivity and habitat security. So land use planning, appropriate recreation access management, they're essential components to mitigating cumulative effects. Especially in the case that we have, which is increases in population and visitation. And that trajectory seems to be continuing. So several recommendations have grown from this work. We're starting to share those with our partners and widely. These are two relevant recommendations, I would say, very relevant for this particular valley. I'm not going to read them for you. So the 2022 cumulative effects modeling that we commissioned intended to provide some evidence-based forecasting on various pathways to addressing conflict, potential conflict with grizzlies. Many of those recommendations were provided in a 2018 report, which many of you probably have read. It's the recommendations for improving human-wildlife coexistence in the Bow Valley. These are pulled together by a multidisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional collaboration between the province, the town, various NGOs like Y2Y. I sit on the technical working group that reports to the coexistence roundtable. And so this slide shows a list of the categories from the report. The technical working group and roundtable are still going through them in a sense of understanding what's been achieved over the last several years, what we have yet to do. And what's recommended here is largely related to conflict mitigation, which is wholly necessary. Like it's particularly necessary in places where you receive visitors like Canmore does. However, these efforts can fall short when we're talking about shifting culture, when we're talking about coexisting with wildlife in ways that enable both wildlife and people to thrive. They also fall short in producing outcomes that support the recommendations that have grown from cumulative effects modeling that I shared with you, as well as our recreation ecology research. So oftentimes these two ideas are conflated, conflict mitigation and coexistence. We use the word coexistence a lot here. Governments often use the word conflict mitigation or the phrase. However, I'd like to offer that conflict mitigation really is just a tactic to get us, hopefully, one day to coexisting with wildlife. Scarcity, that's the feeling there'll never be enough, resulting in fear, stress, anxiety. Abundance is based on the belief that there's more than enough for everyone. So conflict mitigation is about correcting behaviors that of people and wildlife. Coexistence is a state of being whereby space is needed, that's needed for both is accommodated. It can be rewarding. So I'd like to posit that coexistence is about abundance. So how do you get to abundance? How do you get from mitigating conflict with bears to achieving coexistence? How does one get to communities that are abundant with healthy nature? You look towards what creates and supports culture. And for this report that we are about to publish in the coming weeks, we call them wise practices. So these wise practices that I will share a number of scenarios about, these are the categories that I'm going to talk about. They were designed to largely address those three scenarios that we put together for our cumulative effects modeling of limited expansion, informal trails, and managed recreation. Each of these tactics address a different aspect of human presence on the land that I would argue we all can contribute to. So the first piece of inspiration, conservation development. That's essentially about setting aside at least 50% of developable lands for conservation purposes. Imagine that in the Bow Valley, and not maximizing development footprints. So we all enjoy trails, we all live within a community, drive on roads. Conservation development is often implemented at the scale of neighborhoods, so area structure plans. Because of this, ecological benefits really need to be fully realized at a larger scale. They need to be connected to regional scale wildlife habitat and connectivity. So a great example of conservation development might be the neighborhood of Bridgerview in northeast Bozeman, Montana. This was a public-private nonprofit collaboration that led to the purchase of lands from bankruptcy. The result of development consisted of 60 acres of parkland, 40 acres of a wildlife sanctuary, and only 8 acres of housing development. And on this land, there were 62 homes developed, providing an equal mix of market rate and below market affordable housing. So idea number 2, conservation funds. There are 2 types of funds that are used to acquire lands for the purposes of conservation. In some locales, they're known as parkland acquisition funds or conservation funds. Those are the 2 different categories. Parkland acquisition funds, they can be set up by local governments to help achieve public open space objectives. And this type can be funded through taxation, development fees, or dedicating land when development happens or subdivision happens. Conservation funds, they're also established by local governments and funded through tax often or dedicated fee. And those are usually used specifically for projects that support sustainability and conservation goals of that community. The Kootenai Conservation Program, a bit west of here, they coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land. And they generate necessary support and resources for this. So rather than pursuing conservation projects themselves, they partner with various groups, government groups, First Nations, resource industries, nonprofits. Over their 20 years of existence, they've functioned in partnership with over 85 organizations to achieve their mission and vision, which is a commitment to land conservation, stewardship, and sharing knowledge, and building the financial tools to help realize such projects. So the third idea I'm going to talk about briefly is ecosystem services. Those are the benefits that we all derive from natural ecosystems, whether it be fresh water, food, pollination, or aesthetic inspiration or cultural identity, a sense of home, spiritual experience. They're often used conservatively to quantify nature and the value its conservation might bring in the context of development. It's important to consider, but really difficult to quantify the benefits derived from natural assets, including those gained from recreation or spiritual or cultural practices. But to do this work effectively, management of natural assets needs to be a part of an organization's plan. Further, there needs to be dedicated staff to managing those assets. Canmore, through the leadership of Caitlin Van Gaal, has a plan underway, so that's encouraging to hear. So consider the town of Okotoks and their natural asset inventory and ecosystem services assessment report. They created an inventory of all their natural assets and semi-natural assets within the town and assigned a condition and score monetary value to each. And they had seven key ecosystem services that they measured, including recreation. And the total estimated value of their services was about $84 million in 2020 dollars. This included water flow, climate regulation, recreation, aesthetic attractiveness, things like that. That inventory is intended to be used to help support evaluation of proposed land developments. It gives a counterbalance to should we develop. Number 4, visitor use management. So these strategies impact the parks that implement them, such as Banff, as well as the gateway communities that surround them, such as Canmore. So think of the dynamic situations related to our region, housing challenges, growth and visitation. To wildlife, these things equate to just the flow of more people into a region that's already burgeoning with tourism. So parks and protected areas, they have the capacities, they've set capacities to manage people. When visitation increases, people spill over into the surrounding areas. But a lot of the communities in the surrounding areas don't have those means to manage to a capacity. So one precedent to consider is the Becoming Jackson Hole campaign. It successfully encouraged mindfulness and compassion among the community and supported its broader implementation of their sustainable development management plan. This resulted in a really interesting handbook. It's called the Mountain Neighbor Handbook. It's created as a local's guide to stewardship in the Tetons. When trying to manage visitors, it's really essential to consider the same suite of tools used by protected areas, especially if you're adjacent to one. So cross-jurisdictional management, consistency is essential to ensuring wildlife corridors remain effective and habitat remains secure. Also want to talk about Trails Alliances. This is my favorite photo of the slides. So how might we involve the community, involve communities more? How might we foster more collaboration? How might we expand education of visitors and stakeholders? Well, Trails Alliances can offer that. They can help with these things. Recreation-based development is strengthened when Trails Alliances and their membership see themselves as part of the solution, not really part of the problem, or so much part of the problem. Solutions that are based in shared values and are consensus-based can help foster healthy, respectful collaboration and trust between groups. So campaigns for responsible recreation are often best championed by local associations and businesses, and they are the best often to model best practices for recreating with wildlife habitat in mind. So the Teton Freedom Riders, which is this fellow's a member, they're a mountain bike trails alliance. They signed an MOU with the national forest in their region, the Bridger Teton Forest, to maintain the trails that were within that national forest. They also decommission unsanctioned trails, and they self-police users of those trails. And so now they imbue a culture that accepts seasonal closures and has a greater awareness and respect for the needs of wildlife. The U.S. Forest Service Wilderness and Trails Manager had this to say about the partnership. You don't create accountability just through regulation. It has to come from an internal sense of ethics where there is a community of norm that says, that's just the way we do things here. We're respectful of other people and wildlife. So last piece of inspiration I want to share with you all is Indigenous land guardians. So as the work around coexistence advances, the opportunities exist to embrace more fully a two-eyed seeing approach, whereby Indigenous and Western worldviews and science are incorporated and used to develop strategies to manage people on the land and monitor social and ecological change over time. So Indigenous land guardians, they help to manage protected areas. They educate and inspire, provide enforcement, restore animals and plants, conduct and evaluate Indigenous and Western science, and monitor development. Support for such programs provides Indigenous peoples with a greater opportunity to exercise responsibility and stewardship of their traditional lands and waters. And support for such initiative also supports Indigenous rights and their profound connections between the natural landscapes and their cultures. So consider the Kitasoo Hi and the Nuhawk First Nations in British Columbia. In partnership with BC Parks, they launched a new pilot program that designates 11 Indigenous guardians with the same legal authorities as park rangers in the parks. This pilot is rooted in the understanding that these nations have the most experience to steward, monitor, and enforce within their territories. Kitasoo Chief Counselor Doug Niesloss said, "We've been here for thousands of years. We've learned to have a healthy respect for wildlife, such an important part of our culture. It's part of our stories, part of our songs, part of our dances, part of our clan systems. These stories are our law, our values." So imagine if we could achieve such a connection and respect here in this valley through culture with all the people who live, work, and play in this valley. And so with that, I want to also mention that the Wise Practices Report, which is what we're calling it, Wise Practices for Human-Wildlife Coexistence in the Bow Valley. It's going to come out very soon. It's with our graphic designer at the moment. Subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already, so that you're first to know. Also, hot off the presses, I was asked by our manager of communications to put a plug in for the government of Alberta's release of their draft nature strategy. That just came out. There's an online survey you can all take, and the period for public comments closes on November 7th. It's important we all share with that. And so before we rearrange these seats, have a bit of a dialogue circle. I came up with this question, perhaps there's a better, but this I think would be really good to guide us into a dialogue of thinking of some of the things I shared with you, some of the things you might bring to the group. How might we achieve a greater coexistence with wildlife and begin to return more than we take in this valley? So with that, Nick, I think we have to take a pause, and I can ask for questions if anybody has them now, or if your questions are relevant to more of a dialogue scenario, just save them. We'll take a quick break, and good, we have a half hour left.